So, hello everyone, and this is part two of chapter 16. So, I want to pick up at slide 8 on the Federal Reserve Bank. And this is a nice figure from your book, and it basically shows the structure and what the Fed actually does, what some of their tools are. And you can kind of see here that this is the Federal Reserve System here in these boxes. Here's the Board of Governors, and they're in Washington, D.C. Okay, and the Senate has to approve these Board of Governors, and they appoint 3 directors to each of the Federal Reserve Banks. There's 12 Federal Reserve Banks, and basically each has 9 directors, 6 of whom appoint president, and others are officers of the Federal Reserve Bank. So they elect 6 directors to each Federal Reserve Bank, right? And then basically there's around 2,000 member commercial banks. And here's what they do. There's the committee called the Federal Open Market Committee. 7 members of the Board of Governors, plus presidents of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and 4 other Federal Reserve Banks. So there's 12 members of the FMO, the Federal Open Market Committee, otherwise known as the FOMC. And there's also a thing called the Federal Advisory Council. And what do they do? What do all these Federal Reserve System 5 groups in the blue boxes here do? They set reserve. They set reserve requirements. Okay, and they set up the reserve. How much money each bank has to keep in there in reserve at the Fed, and they set interest paid on the reserves. Okay, that's known as the Fed funds rate, right? When banks loan to each other their funds. So that's the interest paid on reserves. And here's open market operations. They decide whether or not they should raise or lower interest rates. Okay. And then here's the discount rate. Okay. They also intervene, as you know, as you saw with the 2008 TARP program, and as you saw now with the coronavirus, how they're dumping money into the system to keep it liquid. So that's some of the things they do. Okay, it's a really, really nice chart here. All right, so the Federal Reserve Banks, the 12 of them, are they're public institutions. They're not, and they're owned by private commercial banks in the district that are members of the Fed system. So this is not by any means a government agency, totally government agency. That's why it says quasi-public, all right? Because there's the Fed in Washington, the main branch, and we'll go back for a minute and we'll look at that. So here's the Board of Governors in Washington, and then here's the 12 that are privately owned, right? So there's a handshake here between government and commercial. So the member banks elect 6 directors for each district, and 3 more are appointed by the Board of Governors. So 3 A directors are professional bankers. 3 B directors are prominent leaders from industry, and 3 C directors are appointed by the Board of Governors. And they're not allowed to be officers, employees, or stockholders of banks. So they're looking at a nice, to set up a nice constituency of the public where it's not all the power is not in one particular hand of type of people. So the 9 directors appoint the president of the bank, and that's subject to approval by the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. So here's the, as we saw before on the other slides part, the Federal Reserve System broken down. And you can see right there that little star. That's Washington, D.C. And that's the Board of Governors, right? So there's the Board of Governors. And here's the 12 Federal Reserve districts. There's 12 districts, right? And you can see them numbered 1 to 12 here. And basically, this is the cities where the Federal Reserve banks are, okay? You know there's one down on Liberty Street. So here's the Federal Reserve branch cities. And here's the boundaries of the Federal Reserve districts, okay? So again, looking at this chart, you'll notice here's where the Federal Reserve Bank is. This is the Federal Reserve Bank, okay? And the like blue circle here, those small blue circles, but they do have branches in other cities. So for instance, if you look at California here, here's the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco, but there's a branch in LA, okay? And if you go to New York, let's just go to New York on the other side. Down on Liberty Street in Manhattan is the bank, but then there's a branch in Buffalo, okay? So each of these is broken down, and the red lines, of course, are the boundaries for the 12 areas. So the functions of the Federal Reserve banks: they clear checks, they issue new currency, they remove any currency that can't be used anymore if it's unlegible or unusable. And they make discount loans to banks in their districts. Now, a lot of times banks don't want loans from them. Banks will take loans from other banks. And they'll look at mergers and applications for banks that want to expand their activities. So they're kind of like a watchdog for banks. So they're a liaison, right, between the business community and the Federal Reserve System. And again, they examine bank holding companies, right, and any state chartered member banks. They use staffs of professional economists to research topics, and I go to these meetings every year at the Fed, and I'll show you some of the information I get. So the one special bank is the one in New York, right? And it's down on Lower Manhattan, and it's the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. And it basically plays a larger role than the rest of the banks. Its district contains many of the largest commercial banks in the United States. Right? Wall Street's down there, right? The safety and soundness of which are paramount to the health of the U.S. financial system. And it's heavily it's the main bank for bonds and foreign exchange markets. Okay, so so the New York Fed, and it's worth if they still let you do tours, it's worth going there for a tour. All right, and again, it's the only bank that's a member of the Bank for International Settlements in the world. Okay, so it plays a special role. Finally, so the last thing is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York is the only permanent voting member of the FOMC among the Federal Reserve Bank presidents, serving as the vice chair of the committee, right? So, so the Federal Reserve Bank in New York is a special bank. So this is the role of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and as I said to you, they have a lot of gold in the basement. And what I'd like to do is just show you a little 1-minute video on the gold. I'm going to add it to this.
Do you think it will Deep in a building on Wall Street lies 6,194 tons of gold. That's 496,950 bars worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The gold law at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is one of the largest depositories of gold in the world, and also one of the most secure. None of the gold is in New York Fed. It belongs to the U.S. government and other countries, but those depositors need to make sure their stash is safe. There's only one way to get into the vault, a 90-ton steel door that spins on a cylinder to open the accessway. When gold enters the vault, the New York Fed uses an old-school scale to weigh and value the gold bars. The gold is then stored in individually numbered lockers secured by 3 locks. How tight is the security? When any compartment inside the vault is open, 3 people, including one New York Fed auditor, must be present to ensure that the gold is safe. Now that's a gold standard of security.
So I just thought I'd give you
in these uncertain
a little
times,
history.
it can feel like everything is running.
Hold on.
But the people we serve are
Hold on.
that even now, their dedication.
So I just thought I'd give you a little history of that, and I thought it'd be interesting to see. All right, so the directors of the Federal Reserve Bank will establish the discount rate, and basically that's the rate where banks will borrow money from the Fed at that rate. So they decide which banks can obtain these discount loans at this discount rate. All right, so they also select one commercial banker to serve on the Federal Advisory Council. And out of the 12 bank presidents, 5 will have a vote in the Federal Open Market Committee. So any national bank must be a member of the Federal Reserve System. So commercial banks chartered by states are not required but may choose to be members. And the Depository Institution Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980 subjected all banks to the same reserve requirements as member banks and gave all banks access to Federal Reserve facilities. All right, so I'll knock this off here and I'll pick the rest up on part 3. We're about halfway through the slide.